Good morning. My name is Stephanie Christopher. I'm the program manager at MDIC for our Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Initiative. And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our patient engagement panel. Suzanne Schrant is the very new Director of Patient Engagement at the Arthritis Foundation, and she'll take the lead on introducing the rest of our esteemed panelists. Thank you, Suzanne.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and I'm really excited about this conversation this morning. Let's see if I can advance. And as Stephanie just shared, I am literally brand new. I just started last week at the Arthritis Foundation, having come from PCORI as their Deputy Director of Patient Engagement for the last almost 4 years. So I'll just sort of continue that same work we were doing at PCORI, but in a new place. And then my passion for the medical device conversation comes from my own experience. And so really feel that it's critical that that patient voice is infused throughout the entire product life cycle. And I think what we've already heard this morning is very exciting, very compelling. So I'm very interested to hear from our patient engagement panel. And I'm going to let Mark, Kelly, Katie, Sally, and Peter come up and introduce themselves. Everyone has a brief introduction. And then we'll move into some prepared questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience as well.
Thank you, Suze. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I want to thank MDIC for the invitation, number one. But I also want to say that I've been a patient advocate for 25 years. And I became an advocate because I saw so many people in my family afflicted with one or more chronic diseases and watched most of them die over a short period of time. As an advocate, the key thing that has run through everything that I have done is engage the patient to understand what's important to them, both in how we deliver care, but in how we develop treatments for them. As an advocate, I've put that out for a long time. I remember when I first came to Washington, D.C. 15 years ago. I was at a meeting at the FDA where FDA officials told me that risk-benefit, because it was risk-benefit back then, was a scientific determination and patients could stay out of it. I was really, really incensed by that. And in fact, I was supposed to give a presentation. And I put the presentation down and I said, wait a minute. At the end of the day, benefits and risk need to be informed by science, but it's a judgment and it ethically has to reflect the end user. And the work that MDIC has done on patient input with the framework and catalog has been absolutely transformative. So all of you involved here at MDIC should be absolutely proud of that. And in addition, I think we should be incredibly proud of what FDA has done. When you look at the folks at FDA in the device section, and what you have done to put patients to the forefront, putting it into your strategic plan, issuing the first guidance document anywhere globally on how to gather patient input, when you see the commissioner's office taking this on, and when you see people starting to push back, we need to step up and support the FDA and the courageous leadership they're having as they implement this. So I want to give them a round of applause. So please join me. It's truly exciting time in patient engagement, and I only have 2 slides, so I'll be very quick. One of the things you know you've made it in Washington, D.C. when we start to develop documents with glossaries of terms. We're starting to get there in patient engagement, patient input. MDIC has been a key player in this. But we're now beginning to develop a language around this that people can understand that's critically important as we move forward. And we're also beginning to understand that having good intentions is not enough. Thinking about the patient is a great start. But just thinking about the patient is insufficient. Because if you think you understand what happens in their daily lives just based on a very limited interaction with them, you're likely to make huge, huge mistakes. To truly be patient-centered, you've got to engage the patient, understand what's important, and use that information to make informed decisions. What's exciting is we're starting to see a realization of this. I had the privilege of being a co-author on 3 articles 1 will be published in JAMA on patient engagement in drug development, and 2 will be published by ISPOR on patient engagement in value. Even in this day and age where we have the creation of PCORI, PCORINET, guidance from CDRH on patient engagement, I had reviewers on each of those documents come back and say, patient engagement, who needs it? It's a waste of time. This doesn't make any sense. We still have a lot of work to do. But with the leadership here in this room, at FDA, within the patient community, and within MDIC and all the folks here, we're going to get there and we're going to make a difference. And I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kelly Close. I've had diabetes for nearly 30 years, and our team's work, let me see if I can just, sorry about that. Our team's work focuses on type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and pre-diabetes increasingly. And that's what I'll be talking about today. And I just want to echo Mark's incredible thanks to MDIC for so much focus on patient engagement. And really kind of for recognizing the rigor of patient data, the expansiveness that this can come to us in so many different ways. MDIC has really been an incredible catalyst in driving this forward. And we are so grateful, particularly on the diabetes and pre-diabetes fronts, where our populations are just absolutely exploding. We also are just really grateful to see so many leaders here really engaged here in the room and online. And I think this question of how to integrate patient views, having you all think so carefully with us as patients on how to do that qualitatively and how to do that quantitatively is really very welcome for me. I've had type 1 diabetes for almost 30 years, and through, I think maybe a decade ago, patients were excited when we were even asked to come into the room and to join the table. But the rate at which the patient questions have really been moved forward and how much you want to hear from patients has been so helpful. So much of that has been driven by FDA. FDA has made it really easy for patients to be able to come and give patient views, especially, I would say, on the medical device side, where we don't always even have to be in the room. We can come to FDA via webcast. We can come via video. This is especially important in chronic disease, where not all patients always have many resources to be able to share their views. I was really lucky to come to this incredible forum last year and was really impressed by the dialogue that was very much propelled through MDIC. That came up in Dr. Califf's keynote last year before he was commissioner, and as well as this morning, Dr. Sheeran's really, really valuable words, and also this just phenomenal discussion this morning between Mr. Minogue and Dr. Califf, where we heard so much about where this could actually move and concretely on what FDA was actually doing. And I think it's such an incredible model agency. It's been great for us to hear about partners and patients. And I also just really appreciated the advocacy on funding for patient engagement, because so many patient advocacy groups do need this. Of course, we, those of us who were here last year, I think were really moved by Dr. Ross Jaffe's incredibly valuable work on patient-centered benefit risk and on future opportunities for patient preferences. I think that as a patient, whether it is in diabetes or across the board in many chronic diseases, we've been lucky to see science come really far. But the science has come far, and patients don't necessarily aren't always able to benefit from it, because views on quality of life, views on adherence, views on different patient-centered outcomes aren't really that well understood. And we really appreciate how far FDA is helping us move on this front to understand the scientific outcomes, but also the real world in which patients live. And I was excited to hear Dr. Califf talk this morning about the strides that he is seeing on the big data front that is going to be able to give us so much more information. The field of diabetes, when I started working in it full time, was about $14 billion in revenue globally on drugs and devices. That's now $50 billion today. There's so many more of us. We're not necessarily doing that much better as patients. And I know that the science has improved incredibly. We just need to make sure that we have a good handle on what will actually help patients both be able to access the drugs and devices. As we heard here last year, if something is approved and it's not accessible, it might as well not be approved at all. So we think there is more work that can be done to quantify patient needs. We're a really diverse group out there. More individualization of therapy and technology can happen. And I think that it'll be wonderful to hear from other therapeutic areas for us in diabetes what we can do better. That's so much of the benefit of what MDIC is enabling. So thank you so much for inviting me here today.
Good morning. How is everyone? So as you've heard from the previous speakers, and you'll hear from the rest of the panel, the patients in the community and the patient groups that they're a part of have really evolved. At the agency, our earliest involvement with direct patient engagement came through the AIDS and cancer arena, where patients were coming and telling us, you need to be thinking about this from our perspective too. And it's really moved a long way. I think these groups continue to do a lot of important advocacy work and fundraising to raise awareness about their conditions and the need for better research and better treatments and diagnostics. But a lot of these patient groups have moved beyond that and are positioning themselves as true partners in discovery and development and in decision making and access and making better treatments about healthcare decisions. And I think all of this is part of what is causing this groundswell of patient engagement that we're all trying to catch up to. I've had a great education from every one of the folks on this panel and continue to learn and be inspired by the work that you and your organizations do and the patients that you represent. As you heard from Jeff and from Dr. Califf, we at the agency and at the center in particular have these strategic priorities, one of which is to partner more closely with patients. And each of these priorities are selected because of the potential to have great impact on the public health mission that is the focus of all the work that we do, while also giving us the opportunity to look inward inside of our organization and to connect that impact to the day-to-day jobs of the people that come to work at the center. And we have over 1,500 employees who are incredibly mission-driven. They come to work every day to protect and promote the public health. They are experts in their field, and they stay at the cutting edge of technology, and we're challenged to stay on top of over 5,000 different types of medical devices. So it's a tough challenge. And the rapid evolving pace of technology and information is a challenge for all of us to keep up with. But it's critical that with all of that scientific, technological, regulatory, legal, and other complexity, we keep our focus on the patient at the center of everything that we do. And you hear a lot about benefit risk in the changes that underpin and form the foundation of what's been happening in the device world. But the reason why it's so transformative is that we used to look at things in terms of safety or effectiveness or substantial equivalence or this standard or that guidance, and we still do. But really, the essence of what we do is weigh benefits and risks. And after 12 years at FDA, I'm incredibly more aware than I was about the enormous amount of variability and heterogeneity of response. And I think many of us, when we're in the patient role, are frustrated by the lack of recognition of that or the lack of availability to draw insights from the data that we know show that. My aha moment as a regulator was when I worked briefly for industry in the cardiovascular space before coming to FDA. And after a few years, I had my first submission in a clinical area I was not familiar with. And at that point, I recognized that what I had been doing in an area I was familiar with was actually more akin to cookbook medicine. I was like cookbook regulatory work, where I looked at the guidance, I looked at the standards, I knew what the previous trials looked like, and that formed the basis of my approach. In this new area, I took a fresh perspective and said, what do I need to know about the condition? What are the patients experiencing without this device? What does this device, what unmet need might it fill? And then to put all the other evidence and information into that mental framework. And so that's really what we're doing with the benefit risk work. And a key part of what CDRH has done with our benefit risk framework is to anchor the patient perspective as a critical component when we look at that information. So the patient preference work, anything that you might be hearing about patient-reported outcomes. Many of you in the device industry are already doing this. We know we're seeing it in about 50% of all clinical trials and about half of marketing applications that contain clinical trial data. So this is not a novel area. This is bread and butter regulatory review that we're seeing at the center. This is really what we're talking about, and keeping our eye on the patient is really the heart of what we all do. So it's been incredibly exciting work, and I look forward to continuing on this journey with all of you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Sally Ogan from Patients Like Me. I oversee our advocacy, policy, and patient safety activities. And I have one slide, and I think it's going to set the tone for what I'd like to talk about. We at Patients Like Me have been doing our work since 2004. And so much innovation does evolve from the experiences of real people. And Patients Like Me evolved from that, an experience of a real family with a real disease, in a real human being, and a real man, and a real son, and father, and husband. And ultimately recognizing the absolute dearth of information that we had available for people to really understand what were those experiences like, and how did other people live with those experiences. And more importantly, how could we begin to measure them and learn from them? And I was struck by Dr. Caleb's comment this morning that, really it's learning, not research. And maybe that's what we really need to start doing, that research can be off-putting to people who aren't necessarily have that a part of their fiber of their life every day. And most people don't think that living every day is actually a research opportunity, but it certainly is a learning opportunity. And I think that we have the opportunity now to suggest to ourselves that what can we learn at the very basic level about the experiences that real people have every single day that actually can be brought into the experiences of manufacturers and regulators and policymakers to really give them a better sense of the things that will matter. So just, again, I want to applaud the MDIC for the work that they've been doing over the last number of years and really advancing not only the understanding of the importance of integrating patient perspective, but also the work that they're doing collaboratively in industry as well as with regulators to really see that there's a science behind this, and that's what I want to speak about. We at Patients Like Me for over 10 years now have been collecting systematically data from patients in qualitative as well as quantitative methods, and being able to gather that data in such a way that it really does begin to tell the story of a patient's experience with their conditions. We now have almost 500,000 members who are registered on the site with about 2,500 different conditions represented. The subset of the conditions where we dive more deeply are smaller, but every opportunity that we have, we begin to explore more fully other conditions that are a part of our profile. But I think the opportunity here is that we've done a lot of our work with the pharmaceutical industry. We've done a lot of our work in the academic and clinical environments related to drugs. And we haven't done a lot of work in the device side. And we see that as a true opportunity, not only because we have patients who are on our site using devices on a regular basis, but because the atmosphere is right. The atmosphere is perfect within the regulatory environment, within the manufacturer and industry environment, as well as in policy to say, let's bring up patient preferences into something that we can actually begin to build the science behind. So I want to just mention briefly that we've been privileged to work with the FDA over the last year or so on what we have a research collaboration agreement. Now that's with CEDAR and OSE, and it's within the Regulatory Science Group. And it's been an incredible opportunity for us to work together with the agency and start to think about what would a research agenda begin to look like as we start thinking about a novel data source, a source of information that they haven't tapped into before. So it's been an incredible opportunity to build that research plan starting at the foundational level, recognizing as a novel data source, we are collecting data in slightly different ways than the traditional methods. However, what we are also doing is systematically collecting it and coding it using traditional methods and terminologies that are very familiar to people in industry and regulations and the regulatory environment. So what we've now have as a result of our first number of studies that have been completed and actually are in manuscript writing right now is characterizations of a novel data source that actually has demonstrated that it has utility for regulatory purposes in that we actually speak the same language in many ways. We've done some testing about how we code our data against methodologies such as MEDRA, and we've had that tested with the FDA staff doing a comparison, how they would have coded that same data, and it's come out incredibly concordant with each other, and others being the quality of the work that we do with our individual case safety reports and being able to gather data in a quality way. So the foundation has been laid. A novel data source can have utility, it can have relevance, it can ultimately be a source of evidence, but we need to continue to build on the standards and the methods and understand the analytics it's going to take to really gather patient data in a way that we really can begin to systematically understand it, measure it, and then see its utility for use in evidence. And I think that's where we're headed in a very exciting way. So I'm looking forward to the conversations. We have some really good questions, I think, keyed up, but I want to come back to the cartoon. Frankly, it is about that one person. It is about that person's story. It is about them taking control and having some opportunity to be empowered and elevated, not only with their own experience, but combining that with the experiences of all of you and all of our clinical experts to really be able to see their whole picture. And that's what patients tell us they want. Recognize me as a whole person. I may have a device, I may have a drug I take, I may have a condition I have, but I am a person living with this on a day-to-day basis, and you can help me do that better. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Good morning. I'm Peter Saltonstall. I'm the president and CEO of the National Organization for Rare Disorders, and as I start, I want to take a moment to compliment both Bill Murray, MDIC, and Jeff for the work that they've done. I'm one of the founding board members of MDIC and have to say today, listening to how much we've progressed in the last few years, I'm really proud. My heart's sort of pounding this morning about how excited I am for what we're accomplishing in CDRH, and it's a compliment to all of you. And so thank you for that. I want to speak just for a moment about who NORD is. For those of you in the room who don't know, we birthed the Orphan Drug Act about 33 years ago, which sort of helped start that life sciences business that's orphan products today. Some orphan products have devices involved with them, but the majority of them are drugs right at the moment. But we are an organization that is a 501c3 charitable organization that has about 242 patient organizations that we act as their voice, if you will. So we work with them to not only identify issues, build patient organizations, and get them more involved and interface with the FDA. So, but I want to say briefly, I'm also a grandfather who has had 2 kids with rare diseases. And I watched what happened with data when one who had a very nasty disease called metachromatic leukodystrophy, which is a really bad central nervous system disease, supposed to live 4 years. He made it to 8. I watched the information be collected by nurses that were coming and taking care of his health at the house every day, keeping all of those records, and he died 13 years ago, prior to all of the information, all the technologies that we have now that are available to be able to capture data. And I watched that information the day he died go into a laptop somewhere and never get connected and brought back to be used for other patients. And so for me, it really drove me, as I actually retired from running a hospital, deciding to want to do something else. I came back to work in this arena because of what it meant to me personally and what I lived through seeing how that data was wasted. So I'm happy to be here today. I'm happy to talk to you all about our experience, what we're doing at NORD, how it relates back to the patient mission, and again, to really congratulate the MDIC for the accomplishments so far. And we shouldn't take it lightly. This is a major step. So kudos to the FDA and to MDIC and to the patients. Thank you.
Great. All right. We're going to get started with some prepared questions, and so I've got those up here. Our first question is for everyone, anyone who wants to take a stab. From your perspective, how have you seen patient engagement go beyond just checking a box to a more rigorous interaction with patients across the product development life cycle? And I'll offer just a quick thought from my perspective, just coming from PCORI. I would say not only did we sort of watch it, observe it move from that tick box type of engagement to a more substantial, authentic type of engagement, we tried to help move that. And we did that by really formalizing processes and tools, things like the engagement rubric that really move from theoretical musings about what engagement could look like to on the ground tactical examples and guidance for how to make it happen. And I think the idea is never be in a position where you're asking, I wonder what the patients would think. Never let that happen because you already know, because you've already asked. And I think now at the Arthritis Foundation, we'll try to keep that moving. But I'd offer that question to the rest of the panelists. How have you seen that evolution happen?
I'll take it. Well, one of the things I'd like to start with is to say that it's very obvious that no longer when I bring up patient-generated data or patient-reported information do I see eyes rolling in the room. And I can tell you it wasn't that long ago, just a few years ago. And even as recent as last year when I was talking at a panel where someone said, well, isn't that just anecdotal data? Isn't that really just not going to be that useful? So I think we've seen a huge shift. The needle has moved, but it hasn't moved because just happenstance. It's moved because there have been different kinds of players in the field thinking about this on a very systematic basis, whether it's PCORI or it's FDA or it's the work that Mark and others do in some of the patient organizations. So I think that in and of itself has allowed us to be taken much more seriously, to see the data as actually having real valid contribution to our understanding of what living with illness is about, and also not only what we can then do about it by using that data effectively. So
that's great. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, let me speak to it from a rare perspective. When I mentioned a minute ago, we have 242 disease-specific organizations that we represent. We have the leukodystrophy organization, which my nephew died from, and then we have cystic fibrosis at the other end of the spectrum. So we represent all of those. And if you think about what's happening at the leukodystrophy side, they're trying to get more and more involved. There's no therapy. They're still looking for people to work with from a research perspective, whereas cystic fibrosis has done, as you all know, developed a drug or helped develop a drug working with Vertex, and it has a lot of data and has been intimately interacting with the company and with the FDA to help solve that problem. And so I think I can really see a progression. You see there's a new Duchenne muscular dystrophy drug approved earlier, or not approved, but pathway approved earlier this week. I think of that organization, which is also a member of NORD, actually writing guidance and helping the FDA be more involved. So I want to say that I've seen a huge evolution, and part of what we do is incubate those smaller groups to help bring that process along so that they are organized well enough to be able to interface. Because I think as we talk through some of the other questions, we'll find that some of the smaller patient groups that may be made up of only 5, 10, 15 people don't know how to interact, and so they need to be taught.
We're going through that transition ourselves as we speak. And so it's definitely true that as you look across the landscape, there are a lot of organizations, both on the patient side and on the side of those that wish to partner with patients, that have moved past the check the box. But it's a process, and I think any individual person within an organization, let alone an organizational unit or an entire organization, has to make their way through that process. And so you heard Jeff mention that we are shooting for 90% of our employees by the end of next year will interact with patients. Well, we see that as the entry point. I think I learned from someone in the patient engagement world that patient engagement, why are we talking about engagement? I'm just getting to know you. It's a little premature. So interaction is really the entry point. Will lead to more meaningful engagements, and some of those will move into true partnership. But I think it's helpful if those of you in the audience are thinking about, what are we going to do with patient engagement with my organization, to begin with the end in mind. What is the purpose or the goal of the partnership that would be, towards the later stages of the more mature engagement interactions? And so for us, we thought about not just the benefit risk decisions that we make, particularly in the pre-market space, but also in the post-market. What are the functions that we do? We challenge staff to ask themselves and then tell us, forget about the challenges right now. If we could figure out a way to get the input from patients, what do you wish we could find out from them? And we learned a lot, and there were a lot of great ideas. And so, we're in the process as an organization, but what we're doing is we're trying to figure out how to build those mechanisms so that we can get that input to meet the meaningful needs and build those meaningful partnerships.
Yeah, just a couple of things to build on this. I mean, it's so amazing to hear about the FDA and how everyone there is very focused on understanding patients. I think we still do, in diabetes sometimes hear, we want the patient perspective, like as if there's one. This is a massive group, and the heterogeneity, especially of this group, I'm not sure is always as appreciated as it could be. I think we're moving on that front. I also just think from the manufacturer perspective, I mean, we have so much in some places, like, we'd like there to be a little bit of focus on checking the box. Like, patients don't even really feel like they've actually been invited in, or maybe they've just been invited in at the end and not at actually the very beginning of product development to meet with R&D, et cetera. And then there's everything from that to last week I was at a big scientific meeting in Munich where literally one of the manufacturers, Roche, invited in 25 patient advocates and asked a bunch of questions about a device that they were building, and said they were taking votes online. All of this was open and transparent, and there must have been as much help for Dexcom, for Medtronic, as there was for Roche. And they absolutely were very focused on improving things for the ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of variance on that. We would love to see sort of a best practices created across all of the different therapeutic areas, because we know that there's so much that we can learn from each other. I think there's also just examples even across the aisle, like looking at the drug manufacturers. I mean, the first time that Eli Lilly had a gathering, John Lechleiter was there, who was welcoming us, and he was there for much of the day, and he was asking questions. And I think there are some really good examples like that we've been excited to see.
So just want to add a couple of thoughts. The National Health Council, and I should have said this earlier, is an umbrella organization of patient advocacy organizations. Many of the groups you would all know representing very prevalent conditions like American Cancer Society, as well as groups with lesser known conditions. We also have all stakeholders in membership, including the biopharmaceutical sector, device, diagnostic, generic, payer, and provider community. Our governance is controlled by the CEOs of the patient groups, which you can imagine the dialogue is quite interesting at times given the issues we take on. One of the issues we looked at was, why is patient engagement in the development of treatments so nascent? And the research that we did and bringing together all the stakeholders to really identify it really boiled down to three things. One was lack of regulatory predictability. Now, this is a couple years ago, recognize. One was communication of what works and what doesn't work. People are keeping information within the confines of their own walls. and not sharing their failures or successes. We're seeing some momentum to shift that, and you heard earlier from the speakers that we need to do a lot better job of sharing data. Third was culture. Really, when we sit here today, the two biggest hurdles now are, again, sharing the data, sharing what works, what doesn't work in a pre-competitive space. The regulatory predictability has shifted dramatically. You have guidance already. You have, in the drug space, guidance that has been committed as part of the PDUFA 6 agreement. It's changing the culture, and it goes to all stakeholders. We still find folks that think that this is unimportant. And it requires a cultural aha moment to really understand why this is so critical. And it's one of the reasons why the patient community pushed so hard to have the 20 meetings on different disease areas. In those 20 meetings, and they were focused in on drugs, FDA didn't really want to do it. We kind of pushed it. And as a result of those meetings, people went in and they listened to people come and say, this is the burden of disease, the burden of treatment, and this is what's happening in my life. And in every single meeting, the reviewers, the folks from FDA walked away saying, what I thought was most important to the patient was wrong. In every single instance. That means what you're starting with, what you're assuming is most important to the patient, often isn't correct. Engaging the patient throughout the life cycle of the development of products is critical to understanding this, getting to that cultural awareness that we can use science to do this in a representative way, to gather the data, to inform the decision making, to allow products to get to market faster, with less cost, less time, and benefit the end user is huge. Huge opportunity, but we've got to work on culture, and we've got to create those cultural aha moments. It's happened at the FDA. It's beginning to happen in companies. It's beginning to happen in academia, but we have to spur that forward.
Great, thank you. The second question is directed at Sally and Kelly. And Kelly, you actually just shared sort of an example of an effective interaction. The question is, can you share some particularly effective ways device companies have worked to engage with patients, as well as some ineffective ways? And are there some practical tips you can give to device companies who want to engage with patients?
Well, I'm going to start by saying we have not actually engaged directly with device companies to conduct particular research projects, but I'm going to talk from the perspective of having done some rather successful and then some ineffective approaches working with other industries. Where I think we have had a lot of really promising work done recently is thinking about ways of optimizing clinical trials and doing that through the input of patients during that process. So there may be times when a pharmaceutical company is in the development phase of their next phase of their trial, and they recognize the importance of starting to bring in some perspective so that they can be sure that the design of that trial is going to be consistent with what will meet the particular patient's interests and needs, and really answer some of those important questions. Some of that comes down to whether an intervention is a necessary one. We had one experience where there was going to be an additional invasive procedure done in the next phase of the trial. In fact, there was going to be two, and the question was, how did patients feel about having to undergo two of these procedures? And there was an initial hypothesis that they probably would be reticent to have this done. But the interesting thing about it, what patients came back with was really surprising to the company. The patient said, if it's going to provide scientific value, then yes, please, let's do it. If you're not going to gain information that's going to change some of the outcomes that you're trying to understand, then there really would be no point. So I think what they learned was that, too often we try to throw in everything into the kitchen sink and gather so much data that we think, well, maybe we'll use that later. Patients are very pragmatic around that kind of question and say, listen, if this is going to provide you value in terms of answering a scientific question, then yes, please, let's follow that path. Where things have been ineffective, and I think it's really partly because of the sort of lack of experience working directly with patients and getting their insights into the drug development life cycle process, and I think it would apply to devices as well, is that the researchers come with a certain pre-organized set of ideas and thinking about what they have in mind to do. And when we then develop it with them and start to get patient input, and patients have a perspective that isn't consistent with what the approaches were, sometimes the research teams on the industry side say, well, gosh, that's too bad, we're going to go our path. So, we actually have stood our ground a few times and said, well, then maybe